Have you ever heard of a slave who stole a Confederate warship, rescued his family in the dead of night, and sailed straight through enemy lines, not just to escape, but to change American history forever? No. Then today on Inspira, we bring you the story of a man whose courage wasn't loud. It was strategic, daring, and legendary. This is the untold journey of Robert Smalls, a name you've probably never heard. But by the end of this story, he might just become your new favorite American hero. Let's begin. 1839, a sweltering summer in Beaufort, South Carolina. The sun sliced through the sky like a blade, and the air hung heavy with the silence only found on slave plantations. That silence broke with the first cry of a newborn boy, Robert Smalls. Born into slavery, Robert was the property of his white master. His mother, Lydia, was a black enslaved woman of sharp spirit and sharper wisdom. His father, likely a white man, perhaps even the master himself, but no name was ever spoken. Unlike other mothers who shielded their children from the horrors of slavery, Lydia made sure Robert saw them all. She took him to public executions. She whispered truths into his ears instead of lullabies. She told him, "You are not free, but your mind is." Robert began to observe the world with a mind far beyond his years. He saw how white men held books and power, and how black people were punished for even learning the alphabet. He realized early, knowledge wasn't just powers, it was escape. At age 12, he was sent to Charleston, a bustling port city filled with sails, sweat, and slavery. There, Robert scrubbed decks, pulled ropes, loaded crates. But what he was really doing was learning how ships moved, how tides behaved, how to navigate and without being seen. No one noticed, no one cared, but the boy pulling ropes by the docks would one day steal a Confederate warship and rewrite history. Every day at the Charleston docks, ships arrived like clockwork, some carrying cotton, some guns, and some people in chains. And below those decks, drenched in sweat and shadows, a young Robert Smalls tied ropes, lifted crates, and absorbed everything. He was no longer a boy. His hands had hardened, his back bent with labor, but his eyes still burned with silent purpose, as if he were solving a puzzle no one else could see. Robert began working on all kinds of vessels, steamers, cotton barges, and eventually even military transports. He wasn't just laboring, he was learning. Tide patterns, cargo capacity, guard shifts, routes of the Confederate ships, where the officers kept their weapons and where they slept. Soon, he was permanently assigned to a Confederate steamer called the Planter, a ship used to transport weapons, ammunition, and troops. Now, Robert was no longer a deckhand. He was operating the wheel, reading navigation charts, changing signal flags, and memorizing Charleston Harbor like the back of his hand. He had learned everything a captain would know. Confederate officers began to trust him, even respect him. They had no idea that the man steering their ship was also plotting to steal it. In Robert's mind, freedom was no longer just a dream. It had become a plan. A near impossible one, yeah, but he whispered to himself, "If I know how this ship moves, if I know when the tides change, then I can sail this warship to freedom." But escaping wasn't enough. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted to make history. May 13, 1862, sometime after midnight, a strange silence wrapped Charleston's harbor. The white Confederate officers had stepped off the Planter, their daily routine, trusting the black crew to handle the maintenance. Robert Smalls stood at the wheel, hands steady, mind clearer than ever. He wasn't scared. He was ready. With quiet precision, the Planter began to drift away from the dock. Through the darkness of the harbor, no one suspected that a Confederate warship was now sailing against the Confederacy. Smalls raised the signal flags, perfectly in the correct sequence. Every checkpoint they passed believed it was just another authorized mission. Not one raised an alarm. But the real test lay ahead. Fort Sumter, the very place where the Civil War had begun. Its cannons were always loaded, and its soldiers alert. Robert put on the captain's coat and hat. He stood tall at the helm and gave the exact signal a Confederate captain would give. The cannons stayed silent. The crew held their breath. And then they were through. They had passed Fort Sumter. Freedom was near, but not guaranteed. Now they faced the Union Navy. And if misunderstood, they could be fired upon instantly. Robert quickly lowered the Confederate flag and raised a white bedsheet, the signal of surrender. The Union Navy prepared for conflict until they looked closer. A black crew, a man dressed as a captain. Robert stepped forward and said, "My name is Robert Smalls. I bring you this ship in the name of freedom." The officers were stunned. The planter was fully armed, loaded with military maps and guns. And it had been stolen, not by soldiers, but by a slave. In that moment, Robert Smalls was no longer a slave. He was a hero of the Union, and soon a symbol of what courage could truly do. When Robert Smalls stepped off the planter and handed it over to the Union, he wasn't just surrendering a ship. He delivered Confederate secrets, military maps, weaponry, and harbor routes straight into Union hands. News of this daring escape reached President Abraham Lincoln within days, and it shook the White House. Lincoln realized that if an enslaved man, without formal training, could commandeer a Confederate warship, outsmart enemy forces, and navigate it through the most heavily guarded harbor in the South, then maybe thousands more enslaved people could help end this war. Robert Smalls was declared a national hero. Newspapers like the New York Times hailed him as the Black Hero of the Union. His act of bravery shattered the belief that Black Americans were incapable of military leadership or intelligence. Robert proved loudly and boldly that courage doesn't need a color. Soon after, he was hired as a pilot for the Union Navy. He led multiple missions through hostile southern waters, often returning to the same harbors where he had once been a slave. Now, a commander in blue. Lincoln, deeply moved by Robert's story, soon authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. And Robert Smalls became the living symbol of that policy shift, but he didn't stop there. Because Smalls knew freedom wasn't just about escape. It was about changing the system that created the chains. He turned to politics. He returned to South Carolina, not as a slave, but as a man rewriting the very history that once erased him. The Civil War ended, the Confederacy fell. Slavery was officially abolished across the United States. But Robert Smalls knew the real war had just begun, the war to change society. Smalls returned to his home state of South Carolina, no longer a fugitive but a folk hero. People gathered to see the man who had once stolen a ship, but now he was preparing to steer a nation. He entered politics, facing resistance, insults, and threats from those who couldn't tolerate a former slave writing laws. But Smalls, as always, refused to back down. In 1870, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. Soon after, he moved to the state Senate, and in 1874, Robert Smalls entered the U.S. Congress. He walked into a building where black voices had once been considered illegal, and now he was there to speak for millions. In Congress, Robert championed black education, civil rights, and judicial reforms. He introduced legislation to protect black voters and fought for fair wages and access to public schools. When asked, "After everything you've endured, how did you not give up?" Smalls simply smiled and said, "Because I knew my freedom wasn't just for me, it was for those still fighting to be free." If this story has already moved you, if you're feeling the weight of history and the courage it takes to rewrite it, then imagine how many more stories like this are out there, unheard, unseen, untold. At Inspira, we don't just tell stories, we revive legacies. We shine a light on those who shaped America, not from thrones or ivory towers, but from the ground, in silence, in chains, and in courage. So if you believe these stories deserve to live on, subscribe to Inspira, where the forgotten voices of history speak loud and clear. As Robert Smalls found his footing in politics, he took a step that was not just symbolic, it was deeply historical. In 1863, while the Civil War still raged on and Confederate properties were being auctioned, Robert did something no one could have imagined. He bought the very house where he had once been enslaved. That mansion in Beaufort, South Carolina, The same one where his mother had been humiliated, where he had once been treated as less than human, was now legally his. The moment Robert unlocked that front door, tears welled in his eyes. But they weren't tears of pain, they were tears of victory. He didn't just move in, he turned that house into a refuge. When the war ended, and many freed black families had nowhere to go, Robert opened his doors to them. He used his former prison as their first shelter. He often said, "This house will no longer witness sorrow, it will now protect dreams." Smalls was no longer just a congressman. He was a living symbol of resilience and redemption. Every step he took, every choice he made reminded the world, if you understand your roots, you can rise above any system that tried to bury them. Through the 1870s and 1880s, Robert Smalls's political presence soared. But as the era of Reconstruction faded, white supremacy began to rise again. Jim Crow laws spread across the South, stripping away the rights black Americans had barely begun to enjoy. Robert Smalls, once a U.S. Congressman, was now on the front lines fighting just to protect voting rights. He received death threats, false charges were brought against him, elections were manipulated just to push him out. By 1887, Smalls had lost his seat in Congress for the last time, but he did not step back. He served in the Charleston Customs Office, meeting people every day, reminding them, if freedom is earned, it must also be defended. He no longer had the power of office, but his voice still held power in classrooms, town halls, and communities. Smalls saw the nation slipping back into darkness, but he chose to stand tall, holding a light for others to follow. He mentored youth, gave speeches at black schools, and told every child who listened, "My story isn't over. The next chapter lives in you." The 1900s dawned, and America was evolving. But for the black community, the path remained full of thorns. Robert Smalls was now aging. His body slower, yes, but his mind sharp as ever. He no longer traveled like before. But whenever he appeared at a church, a school, or a town hall, the room stood still. Not just for him, but for the history he embodied. His home in Beaufort had become a sanctuary, a place where people came to learn, listen, and remember. And to each visitor, Robert would say, "I've seen a world where my mother wasn't even considered human. And now I live in one where my granddaughter holds a book, walks to school, and dreams freely. That is my victory." He dedicated his final decade to education and community service. He helped fund the first black schools in his district and told every child who sat before him, "Your past may be in chains, but your future has wings." He often smiled at the framed image of the planter ship, now displayed in the Smithsonian. He knew then he didn't just change history, he gave it a new direction. It was a quiet morning in 1915. The skies over Beaufort felt heavier than usual, as if even nature sensed that an era was ending. Robert Smalls sat by his window, gazing out as the sunlight gently fell upon the framed photograph of the planter. He smiled. Just hours later, at age 75, Robert Smalls took his final breath. His last words were, "Don't worry for me, I've done my part." The news spread across America. Robert Smalls as the slave who became a hero and has passed away. The black community mourned. Even the white press paid tribute. Because the story Robert lived belonged not just to one race but to all of humanity. Thousands attended his funeral, former slaves, soldiers, schoolchildren, and strangers. He was buried in Beaufort, in the same soil where he had once been sold as property. And on his tombstone, engraved in bold letters, are the words that defined his life. "All I needed was a chance, and I made history." Robert Smalls may no longer walk among us, but his name lives on the lips of every child who dares to dream of freedom, courage, and justice. In South Carolina, students learn his story in school. The photo of the planter ship still hangs in the Smithsonian, and the mansion in Beaufort, where he was once enslaved, is now preserved as a historic landmark. In 2004, the U.S. Navy named a ship in his honor, USS Robert Smalls. And across every milestone of the civil rights movement, his name echoes. not just as a man, but as a message. His story is not just history. It is a living reminder to America. Anyone, no matter where they begin, can write history. Smalls proved that power does not lie in guns or titles, but in the courage to speak truth and the refusal to give up hope. Today, when a child feels helpless or a family feels the weight of injustice, Robert Smalls whispers through time, "If I could rise from slavery to Congress, so can you rise from struggle to freedom." If Robert Smalls' journey lit a fire in your heart, if his courage left you breathless, and his legacy gave you goosebumps, then imagine how many more hidden heroes are still waiting to be rediscovered. At Inspiro, we don't just retell the past. We resurrect forgotten greatness. We bring light to the stories buried in silence. Subscribe to Inspiro and never miss a chance to witness the soul of history. Because somewhere in these stories, you might just find your